It's Sunday, September 28, 2025. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5 Minute News. Our guest today is a former Stripe engineer, former chief of staff for the U.S. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He's president of the policy think tank New Consensus and is campaigning to unseat Nancy Pelosi in California's 11th Congressional District in the 2026 primary election, which he is self-funding. Saikat Chakrabarti, welcome to the Weekend Show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get into the Nancy Pelosi situation first and get that out of the way before we kind of talk more generally about the Democrats and where they're headed. Do you have personal beef with Nancy Pelosi? Because, or is it just the fact that you feel like a lot of Democrats that having an 85-year-old kind of run again, I mean, it's not confirmed whether she's going to run again, but the likelihood is she may, the Democratic leadership, the old guard, are simply too old to take on what we're dealing with now from Trump and his ilk?
No, I don't have any personal beef with Nancy Pelosi. In fact, I've got a lot of respect for a lot of things she's accomplished in her nearly 38-year career in Congress. And honestly, it's not even about age so much for me. I just think, after I saw Donald Trump win yet again, and I saw the Democratic leadership's response to it, and this is not just Nancy Pelosi, it's also Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, I just think they're not taking the moment we're in seriously. I think they're really playing this as sort of a politics as usual. We'll let the backlash of Trump build up and, we'll win on that in the next election. And to that, I say, sure, maybe we'll win one election, but what happens when the pendulum swings back the other way? I think the only way we defeat authoritarianism is we actually have to use democracy to make people's lives better. And, when it comes to Nancy Pelosi, she's my representative. I live in San Francisco. I've lived here for, over a decade. But I did hear her on a podcast after Donald Trump won. And, she was asked quite directly, what did Democrats do wrong? How should they change? And her response was nothing. It was kind of her response was, we did the best we could. The House did fine. We'll do better next time. And I just don't think that's acceptable. I really don't think that's how we should be going about it right now. I think we need to be taking this threat of authoritarianism seriously. And we need to be creating a real plan to improve people's lives when we do take power back.
You did some polling which came out on Thursday that said at least half of those polled said they supported Nancy Pelosi in the past, but think it's time for new representation in California's 11th Congressional District. How do you respond to those numbers? Because obviously it's still tight. There are other Democrats that are wanting to kind of take her seat also. So what is your feeling about the people and their attitude towards Pelosi right now?
Yeah, the theory of this campaign from the start has been that it's really only possible because of this moment. I think Democrats are really frustrated with the Democratic leadership. If you look at the polling of Democrats, they're polling worse than Donald Trump, but even amongst Democrats, the Democratic Party polls below 50%. And it's because, Democrats have just seen this sort of failure of the existing establishment by letting Donald Trump win yet again. And people like Nancy Pelosi, but they're really thinking clearly it's time for something new. And it's actually really similar to what I saw in 2018. I ran AOC's race in 2018. And it was a similar moment. Trump had just won. People were really frustrated with the Democratic Party for, flubbing that election. And they're looking for somebody with some vision of what comes next. But when I look at the moment right now, the appetite for change completely dwarfs anything I saw in 2018. I mean, we held an office opening party about a year out from the election. 500 people showed up, right? And I remember doing similar events with AOC back then, and it'd be 40 people maybe, right, that far out. So I think it's a completely different moment. So the poll really bears out what we've already been seeing at the doors, what I've been seeing on these virtual town halls that I host every day. I think people really are ready for something new. And, in that poll, what we see is that when people hear about the campaign, when we test a positive bio for me and a positive bio for Nancy Pelosi, so we're not saying anything negative, this campaign ends up winning by 6 points. And another piece of this that I do want to mention, it's also because everything I'm running on is overwhelmingly popular, not just in San Francisco, but across the country. When we polled things like a wealth tax on billionaires and centimillionaires, about 80% support for that, right? When we polled banning members of Congress from trading stock, about 85% support for that. These are all overwhelmingly popular policies.
If you read Kamala Harris's new book, you kind of would think that Democrats might learn the lesson that keeping someone who is potentially too old for the job in their place is a route that one shouldn't go down again. Is anybody able to have that conversation with Nancy Pelosi? Are you able to have that conversation? I mean, you are all on the same team at the end of the day.
I don't know if I doubt she'll listen to me having that conversation, but I do, part of the purpose of this polling is also to kind of gently nudge, Speaker Pelosi and say, hey, look, the people in San Francisco are ready for change. They still love you. They still respect you. Don't tarnish your legacy. And that's really what it boils down to. I think a lot of we keep seeing this. We saw it with Dianne Feinstein. We saw it with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It's these beloved politicians, beloved leaders who just stay in too long. And what they end up being remembered for is staying in too long rather than all the good stuff they accomplished. And that's what I'd really encourage Nancy Pelosi to see this moment as right now. Right? She has had an amazing career. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah, ring fence your legacy. I remember with Dianne Feinstein, she couldn't remember if she'd come to work or not when they were asking her questions. And I was like, man, this is certainly time. So it's not a case of ageism. That's not really the case. But the reality is that the US faces an unprecedented period in political history right now under the leadership, it's barely leadership, I guess, but of an authoritarian takeover of the US government. It can't be, as you've said before, business as usual from the Democrats. Something has to change. Is it that the old guard, and you mentioned Chuck and even Hakeem, that they are not best placed to take on the might of this Republican mouthpiece? Because, let's be honest, the Republicans are incredibly well organized. And that is a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I don't think they're well positioned for this moment we're in. I think people like Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, they came up through politics in this era where we just assumed the pendulum's going to swing back and forth. It's their turn, then it's our turn. You know how to do CNN talking points, and that's kind of it. And I think what this moment demands is really two things. Like, one is a whole different approach to how to actually stop the authoritarian coup, because the way authoritarianism works is this constant process of making the abnormal normal. Right. And it does require daily work to push that tide back. I think it means legislators have to see their roles as organizers of civil society. Like when Trump is going after these law firms, right? He's going after them one at a time. It's very easy for these law firms to just fall like dominoes. But if they were able to organize collectively, they could actually fight back. And I think legislators should see their role as trying to do that kind of organizing. I think you got to be fleet-footed. I saw this so many times when I was working in Congress where Trump would say something crazy. And the Democrats' response was, we'll host a press conference next week to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't cut it. By that point, he's done 10 new crazy things, right? Yeah. You have to actually take opportunities and go on the offense. And so I think there's this daily fight of authoritarianism. But the larger thing is, I don't think people like Hakeem Jeffries or Chuck Schumer or even Nancy Pelosi see their role as figuring out how to completely rebuild our economy and our society to dramatically improve people's lives. That's what we have to do. When I look at the moment we're in right now, it's similar, in my opinion, to where we were in the 1930s. There was a very powerful far-right movement in the 1930s that was filling Madison Square Garden with these huge Nazi rallies, right? And FDR defeated that by coming in and building a whole new economy, through the New Deal, but also through the mobilization for World War II. And he dramatically improved people's lives so much through democracy that it just laid to rest this idea that you need an authoritarian to deliver material goods. And that defeated the authoritarians of that era, not for one election cycle, but for decades. So that's the kind of leap in incomes and living standards we need to be shooting for as Democrats. And I don't think, the old establishment in the Democratic Party is even thinking on that level.
Well, they won't even endorse Zoran Mamdani in New York. That's a problem, isn't it? When Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries are refusing to kind of come out and directly endorse somebody who so many people are seeing as the future of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and I don't think they realize just how much damage they're doing to their party right now. And, I'll be honest, I think the only reason they're not doing it is their donors are telling them that they shouldn't, because I don't see any other reason why not. It's politically the obvious thing to do. He's so popular in New York. But by not doing it, they're setting up the standard that we don't endorse whoever the Democratic nominee is, which, I mean, whoever ends up being a Democratic nominee in 2028, we're not going to be able to tell the progressive base and the grassroots base to come around that candidate if it isn't the candidate that the grassroots base wants, right? So they're doing this immense long-term damage to the party in exchange for, I don't know what, like I'm guessing is that they don't want to piss off the donors in New York because New York is a big donor base.
Let's talk about donors for a second, because this is a real problem in American politics overall, isn't it? That money really decides who wins in certain districts, who can afford the biggest campaign. And in most other countries, there isn't the kind of money in politics that there is in the US. You yourself became very wealthy through your work in Silicon Valley, I presume, right? So there is a you have that buffer behind you. Is that the reason why are you kind of making a point here that really self-funding your campaign is a way out of this situation? Because doesn't that just suggest that only wealthy people are ever really going to be able to take on the Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I am self-funding part of the campaign, but I'm also raising grassroots money. And a big part of my politics is actually the result of that experience in Silicon Valley, because it's a lottery ticket. It's really crazy the way our economy works right now. Because, I worked hard for a couple of years, but I didn't work harder than some teacher or nurse does every single day. And yet I win the lottery ticket and I get to have all this money, and most people can't even afford a house, or a secure retirement. I think that's completely crazy. I think an economy set up like that is doomed to fail. I think that's ultimately why a big part of my campaign is, taxing the ultra rich, including myself, to actually rectify the situation. But when it comes to, how do grassroots candidates run if they can't self-finance? And I think we just saw an example of that with Zoran in New York. And I think it's actually replicable across the nation. If people get an option for real change, for something that's more than just small iterative reforms to the current system, you can energize a base and raise enough grassroots money to win. And money isn't everything. Trump actually won being vastly outraised in 2016. I think Zoran got outraised by like 100-1 in the New York race, right? At the end of the day, you need enough money to get your message out, but your message has to actually convince people. That's the only thing money does, is it helps you buy, the ability to get your message out to people. If your message isn't winning, it doesn't matter how much money you have, you're going to lose.
And so just looking to other candidates, but also this kind of idea that big money in politics is a problem that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. And I'm just talking about the Democrats here, because there's a certain amount of hypocrisy, I guess, when Democrats are campaigning to get big money out of politics, but at the same time are also spending huge sums of money that is coming from donors and lobbyists and people that ultimately want to have a say in how politics is going to play out. How do Democrats deal with that hypocrisy in the short to medium term?
I think they have to be able to say no to the donors. I think the worst version of this problem, or like the worst result of this issue of big money in politics, is it actually makes the Democrats this extremely weak, slow-moving, kind of sclerotic party. And I saw this up front, right? Like when I was in Congress, most of the members of Congress, they're spending 6 to 8 hours a day calling donors for money. That's their main job. And then when you present them with legislation that polls really well, we did this multiple times. We would present legislation to, more conservative members of the Democratic Party that would poll incredibly well in their districts, and they wouldn't sign on. And it's because they're thinking, which donors am I going to piss off? This is the exact dynamic we're seeing right now with Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries not endorsing Zoran. It's actually politically incredibly stupid, but they're just doing it anyway because they think the money is the main thing that matters. And I think we absolutely have to break that. And I actually disagree. I do think we can do something about money in politics, because when I look at, the public outcry, the public support for overturning Citizens United, it's about, 70, 80%. And on a whole host of issues, things like getting rid of political corruption by banning congressional stock trading, banning, the revolving door between Congress and the lobbying industry, things like universal health care, universal child care, tuition for public college, all this stuff polls so well. And there's this huge delta between where the people are and what the party's campaigning on. And to me, that means that is a delta to be exploited and used to win a political campaign. That's, partly what Trump did with the Republican Party. He came and he just started campaigning on, trying to rebuild manufacturing, which the party had not been talking about for years, right? And so I think that's a big mistake for the party to not actually embrace the sort of the actually popular policies that so many people want. And it's a risk, they see it as a risk. Like, we'd have to give up all this money to embrace these policies. But I think if you don't do it, we're going to lose. I think that's the way you win, is you campaign on popular stuff.
But it's a seismic shift, isn't it? And invariably these things don't happen overnight. So you have to get buy-in from quite a lot of people. And as I see it, it actually does mean bringing people in who are younger and have a mindset that is very anti-Citizens United, and that, this can change over time. And it takes people like yourself and Zoran to be able to lead the charge. AOC doesn't take money from donors, big donors either. Maybe we can just talk to her success for a moment, because it's a perfect example of how this can be done. She was underestimated hugely, in my opinion, certainly by the Republicans and Donald Trump abusing her and referring to the squad as being radical, when the policies that they espouse outside of America are anything but radical. They're just normal. She has just gone leaps and bounds ahead, really, of where some people expected her to go, with a brilliant ability to not just communicate, but to connect with people. Just tell me, from your experience of working with her, what it is about her and people like her with this kind of the magic, and is that something you can carry, do you think?
Well, I'm not going to pretend I can get the same magic, but I do think, working with AOC, a lot of it just came down to, she was just stating these obvious truths. She didn't have all this baggage behind her of trying to figure out how to say the exact politically correct thing. She was just saying, like, oh, this is crazy. Why don't we do this? And that's what people respond to. People want that kind of authenticity and just a normal person being normal, And of course, she's immensely talented. I've seen her so many times just go up in front of a crowd and deliver a completely unscripted speech and wow everyone, right? And that kind of thing is amazing to see. But I would say the piece that really inspired me from that campaign, because this was during a time I was running a group called Justice Democrats, and we were recruiting people all around the country to run. And she was one of the people we recruited, but we also recruited people like Cori Bush and later on folks like Jamal Bowman. And through that process, I wouldn't say it was obvious that like AOC was the standout star. There are so many incredible people all across the country doing incredible work who, if they step up, could inspire the nation. And I've always thought, imagine if we could get dozens or hundreds of people like that really coming together, campaigning as a group, and we gave the country a choice. Hey, if you elect all these people, not only will you have unbought leaders, who aren't kowtowing to the corporate class, but you'll actually get Medicare for all, universal childcare, ending our endless funding of wars abroad. And I think that's how you get the energy to actually completely change not the Democratic Party, but the entire country, and get this stuff done to build that new economy. And I think it's possible, just because I had this experience of even finding a few folks like that. Imagine what we could do if we really scaled that up.
My favorite thing that AOC did was when she'd had a long day, she'd kind of flop onto the sofa and hold her phone up and just do a piece on Instagram or TikTok to the camera about what she'd been through and what she was dealing with, and how and how insane it was. There was something so authentic, as you say, but real and connective about that. It doesn't cost anything to do these things, does it? So why don't more people do it?
I think people are afraid of being unscripted, and people are afraid of just trying it out. I tell everybody because I'm trying to recruit people to run for office around the country right now, because I do think we need a team of people going in there. It can't just be me. And I tell everyone, just start recording yourself on camera and putting it out there. It's going to be awkward at first, right? Not all of us can be AOC on day one, but you have to go through it. You have to learn how to talk and just find your niche. Like, I think AOC, she really had this way of pulling back the curtain on the whole process. I remember when we first went into Congress, she would just, record herself as she's walking through and just talk about the stuff she would see. That would be so surprising. I still remember we were doing a committee hearing, and we learned this whole process where lobbyists would pay homeless people to come hold their line and spot so that the lobbyists would get all the seats in the committee hearings, right? This is the kind of thing everyone in DC just took for granted. And then when we learned it, when AOC learned it, she was like, what the hell? That's crazy, right?
Yeah.
And of course, that's the kind of stuff that people want to hear about, that people want to see.
We're seeing strong, smart women in Congress. Jasmine Crockett springs to mind as well, who are really kind of pulling focus for really the first time. And this is a shift that needs to be embraced hugely by the old guard. How much do the old guard control the new guard? I mean, is it that they really are the gatekeepers, and the chances of these younger people, because I mean, AOC wasn't old enough to run for president, right? I mean, sure, that wasn't the only thing stopping her, but going forward, at what point do the gatekeepers give way to this new generation?
I think honestly that the gatekeepers just need to be replaced, because when I had that experience the first time with AOC, we went into Congress and the reaction of a lot of the establishment was sort of sideline her. And, regardless of what you think of her politics or what she's running on, you've got to admit she's this incredible talent. She's got this ability to communicate and deconstruct complex ideas that the Democrats could really use. And
right.
they just sort of treated her as like, she's just a social media phenom. We don't actually need to, take her seriously. And compare that to what the Republicans do. The Republicans, when they have these parts of their party, which are often batshit crazy, but they have these parts of their party that are energizing the base somehow. They figure out how to use that, as part of a group strategy, right? Everyone has sort of a role to play. And AOC, really wanted to be a team player. Like she's not the kind of person who wants conflict. She actually wanted to come in and help the Democratic Party. And so I just think that whole experience really showed me that I don't think the old guard can really be pushed. I really do think we need different people leading who are actually thinking strategically, who are actually thinking in more than just 2-year election cycle terms, who are making long-term plans, who are working with outside organizations to do the inside-outside organizing to build a real Democratic Party that can win elections and deliver actual change for people in the country. And I just don't see that happening with our current leadership.
So let's talk about strategy then, because there is a power vacuum as you describe it. And in the face of a tin pot dictator, you really do need to be hearing daily press conferences and instant reaction. You need a whole group of people up on the podium that are actually going to get some media and some press, or stunts if necessary, but a reaction to everything. I mean, and just in the last 3 or 4 days, it has been the weirdest time. I mean, from not least the Tylenol autism press conference, which was just bonkers.
Yeah.
And to me, these are opportunities for Democrats to step up and show that they represent sanity versus insanity. We could even mention the UN General Assembly speech that Trump gave, and just being nuts, abusing our allies, and really trying to shift the entire world to the far and extreme right. The Europeans and the international community, they are partly laughing, but mostly crying, I would suggest. And so they are also, in addition to the people of America crying out for some US leadership right now. In your mind, if you had the ability to be in charge of these responses, what do we need right now? How do we fill that vacuum in this moment?
I mean, part of it is we need more people who can actually go on new media, go on podcasts, use social media correctly. I think we have a few people in the party who can do that. And part of that comes down to I think we don't have people in the party who know what the larger worldview is. Like, what is it that we're fighting for? Because I think people often get this wrong. They think of Republicans as being good at messaging and Democrats as, not doing that. But I actually think Republicans, they came up in the time of Rush Limbaugh doing 3-hour talk radio programs. They have a worldview and they know how to explain it, and they can go anywhere and talk about it. But in terms of strategy, we have to actually stay on things and not let it go. If you think about what the Republicans did with Hunter Biden's laptop, right? They just kept on it and they made it an issue and they didn't let it go. And the few times Democrats have done that, when you look at Kilmar Abrego Garcia, we stuck to it. Trump's numbers on immigration started falling, and then he backed off. Now, I actually think I have a theory here about how Trump is doing, this sort of authoritarian coup. I actually think he's leading every single time with sort of a big splashy move that will create that kind of backlash. So, with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, he did that. He sent to, Saikat with Mahmoud Khalil, right? There was this detention, there's backlash, and they let him out. Or with the tariffs, right? He announces these tariffs and the markets start tanking. And then what I've noticed is in every single time, they wait a few months and then they do the thing anyway. And now they've sort of inoculated society and the markets against the thing. And there's no media reaction. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, he's about to get deported anyway. No one's heard about that. Mahmoud Khalil is about to get deported to Algeria or Syria. No one's heard about that. With the tariffs, the markets don't react anymore to tariff announcements because they've kind of gone inoculated. And I think we're going to see the same thing with free speech. You just did this thing with Jimmy Kimmel, got the big reaction. Kimmel's back on air. Everyone does their, victory lap. And a few months later, we're going to see some other talk show host or a podcast host get taken off air and there's going to be no reaction. So we actually have to stick on these issues and continue talking about it because like what I was saying, authoritarianism is just this daily grind of they try to make abnormal things abnormal. And we just have to keep pushing back on it. The other thing I would say in terms of strategy that I'm not seeing from the Democrats is what are we going to do to protect our elections? Because we know they're going to deny elections in 2026 and 2028. We know that the Republicans have been taking over county election boards all across the country. I have not seen a plan for how do we figure out what those election boards are, which of those election boards we can take back and make neutral again, and start messaging about this coming crisis that's going to be coming our way. We know it's going to happen. Trump just spent 4 years denying an election, right? And that's really key. I think that's going to be, if we can't have fair and free elections, we're in real trouble in 2028.
Trump just sat with Turkey's President Erdogan in the White House on Thursday and kept referring to his 4 years in exile when he should have won the election and was stuck in Mar-a-Lago, best place for him. This is a problem, isn't it? When you have the President of the United States who is clearly laying the groundwork for an additional term, a third term. We saw it when he was sitting in that room with Volodymyr Zelensky, and he was like, oh, well, so you're not having elections because there's a war on? Oh, well, if I did that, they'd have something to say about it. You can see the cogs of the solitary brain cell working, can't you? And so there is clearly, as you say, a plan to not just rig the midterms, but to give Donald Trump this kind of eternal role in the White House. You don't do that much interior decorating and plan to leave, right? So
right.
Why do you think the media certainly, but the people can't get their head around what is happening? Is it too much to qualify? Is it too, is it impossible to intellectualize because it's so outrageous and Americans have been brought up thinking that it can't happen here?
Yeah, I think people in sort of the mainstream media have this feeling that if they say this stuff outright, they're going to sound like lunatics or, cooks, right?
Yeah.
But it's just, that's the reality. You have to say it. And in that same sit down with Erdogan, Trump said something like, and if there's anyone who knows about rigged elections, it's this guy, right? They know. They know they know what Erdogan did in Turkey. They know what Orban did in Hungary. They know the playbook. And it's not going to be, this big flashy thing where they suddenly say elections are off. They're just going to deny enough elections, create enough confusion in a gray area, have the Supreme Court go their way. And then that's it, right? Game's over. That's basically what Putin does. They still have elections in Russia, right? And so I think it's absolutely crazy that we're not sounding the alarm about this. And that the media, I don't know, I think the media thinks like, oh, the election denial story is old news now, so we can't cover it anymore. But that's what they're relying on. If Trump knows anything in that one brain cell, he knows how to play the media.
I want to talk more about the media in just a moment. We have to take a quick break, but we'll come back and do that next here on The Weekend Show. When you start a podcast, it seems like you have to figure it out all by yourself. Scripts, setup, filming schedule, logos. It can be super overwhelming, and every day seems to introduce a new decision that needs an answer. When you're starting off with something new, it seems like your to-do list keeps growing every day with new tasks, and that list can start to begin to overrun your life. So finding the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything can be such a game changer. And for millions of businesses, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the e-commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world, and 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. You can get started with your own design studio with hundreds of ready-to-use templates. Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store to match your brand's style. Accelerate your content creation. Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. Get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you. Easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. And best yet, Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Turn your big business idea into with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/weekend. Go to shopify.com/weekend. Shopify.com/weekend. We're back on the Weekend Show with Saikat Chakrabarti. I'm Anthony Davis. So the media don't really know how to cover the rise of fascism in America, do they? It's all very much business as usual. You know, the morning shows are all like, good morning, it's another day, and, you know, Trump's done this. But because Trump literally wears clown makeup, they think that he is a clown. And so it's you know, if he had a little moustache and a different hairstyle and an armband, then maybe people would take him more seriously. Why do you think it is that the US is simply not kind of cut out to handle and certainly cover this authoritarian takeover?
I think it's still a lot of politics writers in America. They're used to just like reporting from this horse race mentality. And this is this problem with the Democratic Party too, right? It's just like we're looking at politics as a sport. And that's just it's not how you cover an authoritarian coup. You know, you actually have to do follow-up and you have to do investigative, journalism, and it can't just be these headlines. But unfortunately, I think that's where our media is at. I mean, I'd honestly tell mainstream media on the liberal side to look at how Fox News covers stuff right now, right? I'm not saying be biased like Fox News, but Fox News actually would keep following up on stuff in the Biden administration. And it would often be like hoaxes, right? It would be their own made up conspiracies. And this is the thing that's so frustrating is the right always accuses the left of doing the things that they're doing, but no one knows the things that they're doing unless you keep pointing it out. And it's just like this normalization, right? Like I feel like every single time that I see the media reporting on something Trump's doing and not actually saying this is illegal, right? Or this is a huge violation of ethics laws and corruption. They just they've stopped saying because they feel like it's, I don't know, boring to keep reading that, but you got to keep saying it. People don't know that unless you say it.
Is it also that the American people, by nature of the fact that there's not much fat in the day, you know, you have to work very hard to pay your bills. The cost of living is massive in the US compared to wages which haven't really risen in 50 years. That people just don't have the time to engage with the news. I mean, I sometimes think the only people that really kind of watch these cable news channels are when they're on the cross train or in the gym or they're at an airport. But, you know, in terms of actually listening to it and taking the time and forming your own opinion, this is why people are so desperate to compartmentalize. You're either on that side or you're on that side. And I've never really seen it like that. I see us actually as all on the same side. And the Democrats have started to use this language of it's actually more Bernie Sanders and AOC as a coalition, have started to use this language of the people versus the billionaires. Maybe you're not best placed to answer this question, but I
agree with it.
Right. This is a serious issue, isn't it? That Trump is clearly enriching the very wealthiest people in America. Not just through tax cuts, but also through government contracts and everything else. And the poorest people, who never really get a mention, we never really talk about the poor in America, it's always the middle classes, but the poorest people, which are most people to all intents and purposes, are getting the toughest deal here. Is that the solution to this? Is to not to make it about left and right, but to make it about the 99% versus the 1%?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing is when you're talking about, the left versus right frame, that's completely busted. And it's entirely a frame that's used amongst the political elites, amongst the media. But the real battle is, of course, that the majority of people are getting completely screwed by a rigged political and economic system. They have been for decades. And that's ultimately why anybody who runs on sort of sweeping economic change, whether that's Barack Obama or Donald Trump, wins the election, right? And yeah, Donald Trump is creating a Putin-style oligarchic system where he's got his handful of billionaires who are just going to, get their cut of it. But of course, Trump's going to get the biggest cut, through his crypto corruption. And I think we have to actually tell that story. But it sounds, again, I think the media doesn't like telling these stories of corruption because it sounds so like a conspiracy, but it's real. If the conspiracy is real, it's still the news.
Well, they don't like to talk down America. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe this kind of this greatest country in the world rhetoric is just baked into everybody, and that they don't want to be seen to kind of talking down the nation.
Yeah, well, you don't have to talk down the nation. You can talk down the president and the administration without saying America is bad, right? You can talk about how we actually have a history of progress through trying to have more and more people get equal rights through, FDR and trying to bring more and more people into the middle class. The actual history of the country is a history of getting to equality and prosperity for the vast majority of people. And that project is what we're seeing decline. And that project is what we're seeing getting completely dismantled by Donald Trump right now. But I'd say it started getting dismantled long before Trump. He's just sort of supercharging it, right? For decades now, I would say politicians in both parties have been selling our country for parts in cahoots with the corporations and the billionaires. And I think this is another reason why most people tune out the media is they know that story, right? They know that things were getting harder before Trump. So when they just hear the news about, Trump's authoritarian coup, they want to hear, well, what else is there? You can't just campaign on democracy. You have to campaign on how to actually make people's lives better.
It doesn't help that he's lying about the economy. I mean, this is something, again, that maybe Democrats don't do because they don't need to. They don't need to tell lies. And yet the Republican rhetoric is just full of lies, often about Democrats. But Trump said at the UN event, but also generally whenever he's in front of a camera, that we're doing better than ever. And that, he's dealt with inflation. That's done now. We've fixed it. And it's obviously inflation is on the rise. He talks about massive amounts of money pouring into the country. Well, so many of these investment deals have been debunked. It's just simply not true. And so we're starting to kind of get to a point now where you combine that rhetoric with the deportation of people that are picking our fruit and vegetables, that food may become scarce, if certainly a whole lot more expensive. And the language that he is using does not materialize on the grounds. I mean, gas prices is a perfect example, right? He says it's $1.99. People go to the pump, and it's nearly double that. How do we deal with this kind of disinformation campaign?
Yeah, I think there's the reality of it. Like if you actually ask people what their economic conditions are and where they're going to be a year from now, economic sentiment has plummeted. Manufacturing jobs are crashing from Biden era times. And this is, again, it's a typical playbook that fascists always use. There's this idea we have in our head because Mussolini said it enough of times that at least he made the trains run on time, but he actually didn't develop the economy. People didn't get richer in Italy after they elected a fascist, but fascists love to act like they're doing well. But ultimately, reality is a weakness for them, right? And I think you can't, however, win by just saying they're lying. You have to actually win by saying, this is how I'm going to make your life better, right? And if Democrats can do that, because there's going to be an opportunity. There is going to be an opportunity if we still have elections in 2028 to present a real alternative vision to MAGA, because they have this vision. They're saying, you can't afford a house, you can't get a good job because America spent too much time and money focused on immigrants and on people in other countries and not on you, right? And Democrats have to pitch a vision for how to actually develop this country, how to build up the high wage industries, how to give people means of making a living, which is kind of what Trump campaigned on in 2016. People really thought that's what he was going to do, but he's not doing it. And I actually don't think the misinformation can cut through reality if the other side is good at actually getting their message out, which you have to be good at that.
It would be remiss of me not to ask you very specifically about your policy pledges for your campaign. What is it that is the differential with you, and how are you presenting these policies?
Yeah, I mean, I would say at the end of the day, the big differential is I do believe we have to fundamentally fix at a structural level these big problems that have led to what you talked about, wages being stagnant for most people while the cost of essentials have been going up. And I think there's three big buckets of stuff we have to fix here. One is we have to make the essentials affordable. So that means universal healthcare, universal childcare. I talk about tuition-free public colleges and universities. I talk about, as a very San Francisco issue, but creating public power in San Francisco, which is actually under federal jurisdiction. I can get more into that. And I talk about actual public financing to do a mass affordable housing building project in the country, because housing is the number one reason people can't afford to live here. The second piece of this is we got to end political corruption. We got to ban congressional stock trading, ban the revolving door between Congress and the lobbying industry. And I do believe we can overturn Citizens United just because there's such wide bipartisan support for that all across the country. And then the third piece is we've got to take on wealth and income inequality directly. I call for a wealth tax on centimillionaires and billionaires in the country. But I also talk about how to actually build up high wage jobs, because we've got this global green transition that's happening right now, with or without us. And we're just missing the boat on this massive economic upgrade that could dramatically raise wages. It would be bigger than the World War II mobilization in terms of creating the new industrial base. And we're just completely missing the boat on it. And I'd say all of those things I just said are not policies that Nancy Pelosi supports. So that's our big differentiator.
But there are some similarities with Kamala Harris's campaign there. And I think that, she gets a lot of flack, unwarranted in my opinion, because that was the closest election in history. And so that just goes to show that a lot of those policies are extremely popular. And, I'm sure people have their opinions about how the election could have gone if Elon Musk hadn't invested so much money in it, giving people $1 million to vote for Republicans. But as I see it, the country as a whole agrees with you and with Democrats. Trump represents a minority, really. They just seem to make the most noise. And this is a huge problem, isn't it? Because it's like, the country as a whole is progressive, certainly on the major talking points such as abortion and gun ownership. Really the country when polled nationally. But that seems to be irrelevant to the current leadership. So it does feel like the people en masse are not actually properly represented right now. Is that the gap in the market you're going for?
I would say that, in the last election, I think most people actually don't know a whole lot about these specific policies. If you tell them, do you support universal health care? Yeah, but, they don't know all the different versions of, how that could happen. I would say ultimately what people really do believe is that the current economic and political system needs to just be completely changed. It won't be like, we can't just reform our way out of it. We have to rip it off and actually build something new. And I'd say Trump just represented that sort of change. He embodied it in a way that Kamala did not. And it didn't come down to policies. I think it just came down to, things like Kamala not being able to articulate how she would be different from Biden. And it was an election where people really were looking for change. Yeah. Right. But yeah, I completely agree that the vast majority of Americans are not represented by the current administration, and they don't, I'd say, feel represented by the Democratic Party, partly because of the issue of money in politics, partly because they see the Democratic Party as it is today as also being somewhat corrupt. But also, I think they just don't think the Democratic Party is effective. They don't see the party as builders. They don't see them as people who go in and actually effectuate this change. So I do think you need new leaders who have a kind of competence. And, as much as it's weird for us to, we know everything we know about Trump, I think a lot of the country did have this idea of Trump being this builder, as much of that, it's a total con job, of course, but it helped him a little bit.
Yeah. Certainly helped him with his ballroom, which is the one thing that he seems to actually take an interest in. And, you see, he kind of lights up when he's talking about that thing. Everything else he doesn't seem to have any interest in at all. I just want to talk about something that you touched on, which is a bit of a dirty word in this country, and that is green energy. and the green revolution and the industry that comes from that. In Trump's UN speech, he basically was focusing on immigration internationally and green energy, and called it a hoax and called it a scam, and said if you talking to the international community, if you invest in this stuff, your countries are going to go to hell, and all of this. All lies, all completely insane, and represents a school of thinking from decades ago, because the rest of the world has moved on and is committed to being carbon neutral and has invested in wind farms, wind turbines, not windmills. Apologies to the Dutch for that. And also solar. And I mean, it's a huge industry for jobs, for construction, but ultimately bringing down the cost of energy at home. Once the infrastructure is built, then the energy is effectively free. This is a huge issue in the US because people have been brainwashed by Trump and this rhetoric for nearly a decade now that there's something somehow wrong with green energy. You had this helping to launch this kind of Green New Deal with AOC. Just talk to that and how you see kind of changing people's minds and hearts about the green revolution and the jobs and the productivity that it can actually create.
Yeah, I often lead on this issue by talking about how it's not just about tackling climate change. And if you do poll people, the majority of Americans still believe climate change is real because it's reality, right? But they just don't think that's, the major issue we need to be focused on. I think the issue is we are acting like Kodak and the digital camera revolution is just happening, right? We're going to go the way of the dinosaur if we don't jump on this. And you're seeing countries like China and a bunch of European nations who are taking this seriously, and they're using this opportunity to build up wealth, right? They're building up wealth for their middle class, for their working class, for their countries. And that's ultimately the opportunity that we're missing out on. Now, I worked on the Green New Deal for the past 5 years at New Consensus. We've been working on a much more detailed version of that called the Mission for America. And it's, multiple hundreds of pages of our version of kind of a Project 2025. Like, here's what we do on day one to build the economy that can create vast amounts of wealth for the American people, right? And I think this is a key part. I think Democrats can't just run on expanding the social safety net. I think people in a large part of the country have seen how they used to have this chance to graduate high school and get a $50 an hour job at a Ford factory, and that's been decimated and replaced with minimum wage jobs at Walmart. So what do we do to actually give all those folks a real way to make a living again? And this is the path, that we can actually put the country on a mission to do it. But I agree, it's not just about green energy. It's about how do we actually build up high wage industries the way China just did. I mean, I think it's so crazy that, 10 years ago, China started making EVs. And here in America, we were being so smug. We were saying, oh, there's no way they'll catch up to us because our technology is superior. Right. And they basically started making better EVs than us last year. And now we're like, we can never catch up, right? And to me, that's so weak. That's just so sad, that we don't have the capacity to actually try, right? We should absolutely be trying. And we've done it before. We've done great things in this country before. We can do that again.
But it doesn't help when Trump's cancelling all the subsidies, which of course the kind of ICE engine manufacturers got as well. I mean, it's not like subsidies are just for EVs. All companies had been getting them. But it's problematic when he's lying about, he says, oh, China doesn't even, they make windmills and they export them, but they don't have them themselves. I mean, it's just completely false. China has more wind farms than anywhere else in the world. I guess all this stems from Trump's golf course in Scotland, where he had that kind of the view of the wind farms, lost the case and couldn't get them taken down. I've always thought about the Democrats leading with this idea of employing the Defense Production Act and putting the nation to work with the biggest kind of green industrial movement in history, where everybody gets a job and everybody gets to help build a solar panel or put up a wind turbine and then kind of reaps the direct benefit. I mean, it would be so empowering for people. But as you say, it does seem like we're using that kind of Instamatic camera compared to the digital revolution.
Yeah, I think it's this huge opportunity. And when you look back at the history of the 20th century, because I'm talking about, World War II mobilization in America, but really every rich nation in the modern developed world went through these phases where they dramatically transformed their economies. They went from being poor countries to rich countries, and they often did it in a very short period of time, in like 10 years. And we look at how they actually did that. It was usually some new movement that came in, and sometimes because of war, that's how we did it. But sometimes it was just like, let's just get rich as a nation. That was sort of the overwhelming mission. They would really set the country on this mission. They would organize civil society. It would be a leader who'd be actually trying to get everybody involved in the mission. And they would also do another thing very differently than how we do today. They would pass comprehensive plans to execute this mission, not just like passing a few policies. And so, when I look at Biden's IRA, I think it was great, but it was sort of some policies with no real way to make sure they get executed well, right? It wasn't a comprehensive plan. And then they had institutions that would actually finance and execute those plans. We used to have many of these all across the country. The largest by far was something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is like the engine of growth for the New Deal and during the World War II mobilization. And a lot of what we have to do is actually do all of this again, right? It's like this whole of society approach to do this kind of an economic transformation. And it's really, it's really a shame because we invented this playbook for how to transform economies. China took that playbook, and that's what they're doing right now. South Korea took that playbook, and that's how they became a rich nation. Japan did it. You go down the list, they all did it. And we decided to throw the playbook away. And now you got someone like Trump who comes in saying the right words in some ways, like, yeah, I'm going to build back manufacturing, but he has no interest in doing it. And I'd say on the Democratic side, we actually need to learn that, and we shouldn't shy away from calling for a big, massive movement like this to build up our industries. Just because the IRA didn't win us the election last time, we got to actually go bigger. We got to do more.
Part of the problem is that this huge investment that he talks about with AI and everything else is ultimately just data centers. I mean, that's just, it's a construction job that lasts for 3 to 6 months. You build the data center and then you have like 12 people working there maintaining it. That is not going to fill the job vacancies that we're seeing every month. So how do we kind of harness technology and certainly AI and make people understand that this is something that will be financially beneficial to working people?
Yeah, especially when it comes to AI, I see it as similar to like the automation revolution when it came to manufacturing.
I was going to ask you that because, I mean, again, it's a word that is so important and no one really talks about it.
Yeah, I mean, it could be this huge disruption in our society. It's just coming our way. And I think right now it boils down to the same problem. We just don't have any sort of state capacity or, we don't do any sort of planning. Planning is a bad word in America to actually make sure this sort of this technology that should create all this productivity should be able to be leveraged for new wealth. We don't do that for working people. Instead, we're just going to have it happen this chaotic way and let Sam Altman decide our futures, right? Whereas if you look at, say, how Germany handled automation in their car manufacturing sector, they have this system where they have labor and government and corporations all sitting together and they kind of do some industrial planning together, right? And so when manufacturing got introduced into their car manufacturing, when automation got introduced in their car manufacturing, they actually planned it out. And the result was German auto workers, by the end of that, this has changed a bit now with the rise of EVs, but by the end of that, they were making double the wages of Americans. They were producing way more cars per capita than America was. And they actually had more automation, right? So I think in America, the way we solve and the way we tackle the introduction of AI coming our way is we actually, as a society, need to start planning how we introduce it. We need labor to have way more of a say, right, on how AI gets introduced into their workplaces. And we could use this as a source of wealth to help all the other sectors, to help our manufacturing sector, to help create real wealth for working people. But that won't happen on its own.
It does require a huge shift in skills and training, though, doesn't it? Because so many people just don't have what is necessary. I mean, I remember when Trump was talking about the cell phone manufacturers coming here and manufacturing out of the US and how people can do these jobs. But even all of those people that sit on the production line screwing tiny screws into phones are highly trained, highly skilled individuals. It's not an easy job. And yet there's no talk of training or retraining people and giving people a new skill set that is fit for a modern America.
Yeah, and this is when I say comprehensive planning, that's what this means, because in the past, we've also done the flip side of that, where we've just done retraining. After the Great Recession, we had a lot of retraining programs, but there's no job at the end of that. And they're huge failures. But if you look at, say, France, France, when they built out their high-speed rail, which is an amazing high-speed rail system, the TGV, it was during this era in France's growth where they were doing these comprehensive plans to develop the entire economy. So when they were planning that high-speed rail, at the same time, they're planning out their energy production with the mass, nuclear. France has one of the largest nuclear arsenals, nuclear power plant arsenals in the world. And they're planning that energy production to power the high-speed rail. And they were creating new universities to train up the engineers and the skills necessary to do both of those jobs, because those were both very high-skilled jobs, right? So you have to actually think of your society and your economy in a holistic fashion like this if you want this stuff to succeed.
It's funny you mentioned high-speed rail. I often use that as a barometer for how a country is going with its investments. And Trump just cancelled the high-speed rail, the kind of LA-Los Angeles route, right? I mean, this is... And billions were spent. He's also just cancelled a huge wind farm project as well. And they're saying that potentially there's 90,000 people could lose their jobs in that kind of green energy, not to mention the trains. I mean, most developed nations have high-speed rail, and it's brilliant, and it works. And there's nothing. I mean, we're still doing the Greyhound bus here. I mean, just talking infrastructure for a moment, how important is that? Because it's not something that Trump has any interest in. He, obviously, apart from the ballroom, which is the infrastructure that we're going to get out of him over 4 years. But how important is that to move America on and try and get it to kind of keep up with the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, like you, I kind of see our ability to do high-speed rail, which is this basic technology, as a test of what our state capacity is. And, if you look at the high-speed rail project in California, yeah, I mean, Trump just canceled it, which sucks, but it also has been a disaster for, a decade or more than a decade at this point.
It's made people very rich, though, hasn't it?
It has made a lot of people very rich. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's actually, I've talked about how France did its high-speed rail. If you compare that to how California did, it was the polar opposite. There was no comprehensive planning. We kind of farmed out the whole thing to consultants from the start who were just like fumbling around. We didn't think about, any of the local jurisdictions or any of, what to actually do to make this project a success. It just didn't have this overwhelming amount of sort of will behind it. Now, that was a mistake. I think we can fix those mistakes and actually build high-speed rail, and we should do it correctly this time. And I do often look to, when China started building high-speed rail, I remember the first line they built, it was from the Shanghai airport to the city center. And at the time, it was the most expensive per mile of rail that any country had built. And I remember all of the Western media like making fun of them. It was like, see, China will never be able to build rail. They can't do it. And now, years later, because they just kept going, they learned from their mistakes and they just tried to make it faster and cheaper. They build, way more high-speed rail than any country in the world for cheaper and faster than any of us, right? And so we actually, I'd say, yes, we've made a lot of mistakes on high-speed rail. We should learn from that. But it shouldn't keep us from still trying. I think the worst thing we can do as a nation is just give up and say we can't do this stuff anymore. And it requires state capacity. That's really what it is. We've dismantled so much of our state capacity at a state and federal level for decades. And that experiment has not worked out. We actually have to build it back.
Demonizing other countries is something that Trump does very well. And, he referred to kind of countries with populations with brown skin as shithole countries invariably. But he's underestimating the rest of the world. I mean, he practically fell out with Narendra Modi recently over tariffs and other things. India is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. I mean, the US should be in bed with India. And the last we saw of Modi, he was hanging out with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. I mean, this is Trump's doing, but by misunderstanding his role as a diplomat. How important are these kind of developing nations that have basically now developed to America?
Yeah, I think Trump is pushing so much of the world, both in terms of our allies and, people who are neutral with us, into a camp that's just anti-America, which is so dangerous, right? I think we have to recognize that the rest of the world is getting wealthier and they're, developing their own economic and political power centers. And I believe our approach to the rest of the world has to be to actually bring them into the fold and make the project of having a better world together be a group project that we're all a part of, right? Rather than the continuous antagonizing of these major powers. And I don't know, some of this stuff, it's hard to like really speculate on what's going on in Trump's brain. As you know, like, I don't know how much of this is just like his personal petty politics and how much of it is him overestimating America's power.
There's no strategy. I
don't think there's a strategy. I think it's just, he wants to say, I solved the India-Pakistan, war,
conflict.
Like the tensions there. And Modi's like, no, you did it. And so now Trump's offended that Modi didn't go along with his bullshit. Right. So it's just, it's showing us how like maybe we could have gotten away with this in an era decades ago when America really was this a huge superpower and everyone was relying on us. But that's not the world we live in now. Right. Everyone does not rely on us in the same way. And we still, yes, have some levers of power that we can leverage, but it's so short-sighted and it's going to create so much destruction, what Trump's doing right now.
Well, it's already happened. I mean, look at tourism, for example. Why would you want to travel to the US? And nations now are giving travel advisories from their state departments about coming to America. I don't think he kind of realizes that when you demonize people and you threaten to take their phones away and detain them potentially, that is going to have a knock-on effect on how the rest of the world kind of looks to you.
I mean, I think if there's any optimism in all of this, from my standpoint, is all of this, the reality of all of this is going to be economic devastation for the country. It really is. And there's no escaping that. And in that moment, Democrats are going to have a real choice to make. Are we going to campaign on just like anti-Trump, return to a pre-Trump status quo? Let's just like get funding back for the programs we had before that weren't perfect, but they're there. Or are we actually going to pitch a real vision to build a whole new economy and a whole new society that dramatically improves people's lives, that fixes a kind of, runaway inequality that was going on for decades? And I think the country will be ready for that second message because of the extreme devastation that Trump is causing. And we have to jump on that. We have to actually win on that and then deliver on that.
You've tapped into something really important, I think, and that is that this is a huge opportunity. That as terrible as it is to have, the US fall to a dictatorship, it actually exposes the opportunity for Democrats to come together with Republicans who don't subscribe to fascism, because I don't believe that Republicans are all fascists for a second. And I feel that Democrats need to offer former Republican voters a soft place to land. How important is it to kind of reach out to people that don't buy into Trump's lies and his rhetoric and say, come over here and to reality rather than this kind of fantasy world?
I think extremely important, right? I think when you look at the people at the top who have just been political opportunists in all this, and they're just grifting. And, I'm talking about folks like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and, all the sort of tech oligarchs. No, we don't need to bring them into the fold. But when it comes to voters, I think voters voted in good faith thinking Trump was going to make their lives better. I think a lot of them did, right? And we have to show grace to that. And we can't be making fun of that, right? And we have to actually offer them, we have to show to them like, hey, this didn't work out. This is what we have to offer. And it's the only way, because the other thing here is, I just say strategically, Democrats have had this strategy for years now where we just go after these swing seats, right? We just go after purple districts and purple states. If you look at the map going in 2032, because people are leaving California and moving to Texas, people are leaving New York and moving to Florida. Even if we win all the swing seats in 2032, we're in deep trouble. That can't be our electoral map. We have to have a message that can win in traditionally Republican states. And I think we know that message. It absolutely is a sort of economic populism that's talking about fixing the system and actually making people's lives better. I think there's a reason why people like Bernie Sanders poll better than any Democrat in all these, purple and red states and districts. So it's possible to do. We just have to have the courage to try it. We have to have the courage to, give up our big donors and talk about the stuff that people actually need and be unbought and deliver on that.
California is a good example, isn't it? Because people think of it as being this very left-leaning place, but more people voted for Donald Trump in California than anywhere else. And that's a problem, isn't it? When you are desperately trying to segregate and compartmentalize, you actually miss out on a huge number of potential votes. So you don't even want to take it easy in California. You still need to convince Californians, not necessarily Republicans or Democrats or undecided or independents, but Californians, what's best for them.
Yeah, because in California, the underlying issue that led to someone like Donald Trump rising is worse, which is our cost of living, right? Our cost of living in this country and in San Francisco, I often say San Francisco is like a canary in the coal mine for the country, because all the problems we have here, we have them very acutely in San Francisco, whether that's our housing affordability, our mental health, illness on the streets, drug addiction crises, our public safety. But you see versions of that everywhere in the country. It's coming for the rest of the country. It really is. And so if we can't actually solve this stuff at a root level, the reactionary politics against, rising cost of living is going to keep going towards authoritarians, because it is easy to deliver this message of I alone can fix it. Democracy is a problem. All these people trying to agree on stuff. That's the problem.
Finally, we touched on the word fascist earlier. Trump just designated Antifa a kind of domestic terror organization or terrorist group, which is ironic considering that there is no Antifa group. It's kind of a virtual thing. I am anti-fascist, and I presume you are too.
Yeah.
Would it be a good idea for the Democrats to rebrand as Antifa, maybe, and invite everybody in? Because, if Trump is the fascist, you really do need the alternative to that. And so it's not about badges. I can see it happening.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah, that's a brilliant idea. I agree. I mean, we can't shy away from this stuff, because ultimately, of course, him labeling Antifa as a terror organization. And if you read the fine print on that, Antifa is anybody who's out there protesting ICE. It's just a way to start taking away the right to protest, the right to free speech for anybody that opposes this dictatorship. So we can't pretend that us doing the right amount of respectability to that is going to keep us from being in the crosshairs, right? We are absolutely the target. All Democrats are a target of this administration. So you might as well just go into it with that knowledge. And let's all be Antifa.
I wish you luck with your campaign. And I think you'll do really well. Just based on our conversation, I think you kind of know where it's at, and that's a great place to start. So for now, Saikat Chakrabarti, thank you for joining the Weekend Show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5 Minute News, or by joining the 5 Minute News YouTube channel. I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.